Some things don't wait to be found, they wait for the right man to notice them. The fence line stretched along the far edge of Caleb Turner's ranch like a tired scar across the land, weathered wood posts leaning into the wind, as if they had long since given up standing straight. And that morning the sky hung low and pale, the kind of gray that made everything feel quieter than it should have been, the kind of silence that pressed against a man's chest without asking permission. And Caleb almost didn't see her at first, just a shape against the fence about 50 yards out. Something small and still, too still for a place where even the dust seemed to move, and he slowed his steps without realizing it, boots crunching over dry gravel as the wind carried the faint scent of cedar and sunburnt earth. And then the shape shifted, just barely, enough for him to catch the outline of a young horse, a filly, tied to the fence with a length of rope that hung loose in a way that didn't make sense, not tight enough to hold, not slack enough to ignore. And Caleb stopped where he stood, hat brim low over his eyes, studying her the way a man studies something that doesn't belong in his world. Because out here, nothing just appeared without reason. Nothing stayed still unless it was waiting. And the filly didn't pull, didn't pace, didn't make a sound. She just stood there facing him, her coat a dusty pale gold that caught what little light broke through the clouds, her ribs faint but visible under the skin, her mane tangled by wind and time. And yet there was something in the way she held herself, not broken, not wild, but watchful, like she had already made a decision and was waiting for him to catch up to it. And Caleb felt that old instinct stir in his chest, the one he had spent years trying to ignore, the one that whispered trouble came wrapped in quiet moments just like this. And he exhaled slowly, dragging a hand along the edge of his jaw before stepping closer, each footfall measured, deliberate, as if the ground itself might shift under him if he moved too fast. And when he got within 10 feet, he saw it, a small piece of paper tied to the rope just below the knot, edges curled, stained from dew or something else. And it fluttered once in the wind like it wanted to speak, but couldn't quite find the words. And Caleb frowned, glancing once over his shoulder at the empty stretch of land behind him. No truck tracks, no open gate, no sign of who had been here before sunrise. Just the long, quiet line of hills in the distance and the low hum of nothing at all. And that was what unsettled him most. Not the horse, not the rope, but the absence of anything that explained it. And the filly took a single step forward then, slow and careful, her ears flicking toward him, her dark eyes fixed on his face in a way that felt too steady, too knowing. And Caleb felt it then, that strange pull, like standing at the edge of a memory you couldn't quite reach, something familiar in the way she looked at him, not asking, not afraid, just waiting. And he swallowed once, crouching slightly as he reached toward the note, fingers brushing the rough paper. And for a moment the wind died completely, the world holding its breath as if whatever was written there mattered more than anything else on that empty stretch of land. And Caleb hesitated, just for a second, because somewhere deep down he already knew this wasn't just a horse left behind. This wasn't some careless mistake or rancher's problem to solve. This was something else, something that had been placed here on purpose, something that had been waiting for him long before. He stepped outside that morning, and the filly didn't move, didn't blink, didn't break that steady gaze as if to say, without a sound, that whatever came next had already begun. Caleb did not unfold the note right away. Instead, he let his fingers rest against the rough paper, as if it might disappear the moment he looked too closely. And the filly shifted again, just a small adjustment of weight, but enough to draw his attention back to her. And up close he could see the fine tremble along her flank, not from fear, but from something deeper, something held tight for too long. And he noticed then that the rope around her neck was not tied with urgency, but with care, a clean knot, deliberate, almost gentle, like whoever left her here had taken their time. And that unsettled him more than anything else, because careless men left messes. But this was not a mess. This was a decision. And Caleb straightened slowly, scanning the horizon once more, his eyes tracing the fence line in both directions, counting posts out of habit, noting the absence of broken wire or disturbed dirt. And there were no hoof prints besides her own, no second set, no drag marks, nothing to suggest how she had arrived. And for a brief moment the thought crossed his mind that maybe she had always been here, that he had somehow missed her yesterday, or the day before, but he dismissed it just as quickly, because a rancher learned the language of his land, and this land had said nothing about a horse tied to his fence until this morning. And that meant something had changed, and when he finally untied the note, the paper came free with a soft crackle, edges stiff from drying in the open air, and he turned it over in his hands, noticing the way the ink had bled slightly into the fibers, as if written in haste or under poor light. And he opened it carefully, flattening it against his palm, and for a second the words refused to settle into meaning, broken by smudges and faint lines, but then they came together, slow and heavy, like something rising from deep water. Do not let her go back there, before they come back. And Caleb felt the weight of the sentence before he fully understood it. Felt it settle somewhere behind his ribs where instincts lived longer than logic. And he read it again, quieter this time, as if the wind might carry the words away if he spoke too loud. And the filly lowered her head slightly, not grazing, not searching, just holding that same stillness as if she had heard the message 1,000 times already. And Caleb folded the note once, then again, slipping it into his shirt pocket with a motion that felt more final than it should have been, and he reached for the rope, loosening what little tension remained before sliding it free from the fence post. And the filly did not resist, did not bolt or pull away. She simply stepped closer, one careful stride at a time, until she stood within arm's reach, her breath warm and steady against his sleeve. And he hesitated before placing his hand against her neck, feeling the heat beneath her skin, the quiet strength that had not yet given up, and she exhaled softly, a sound barely louder than the wind brushing through dry grass. And Caleb looked down at her, really looked this time, at the depth in her eyes, at the way they did not flicker or dart, but held steady like they were anchored to something far beyond this fence line. And he realized then that she was not waiting for permission. She was waiting for direction, and not from herself, but from him. And that realization settled heavier than the note in his pocket, because it meant this was no accident, no stray wandering onto his land. This was something placed in his path with purpose. And as he turned toward the open stretch of pasture leading back to his barn, expecting her to follow, she did not move, not even a shift of weight. And when he glanced back, she was no longer looking at him, her head angled slightly toward the distant hills beyond the far ridge, ears forward, body still, as if something out there had called her name long before he ever arrived. And Caleb followed her gaze, eyes narrowing against the pale light. And for the first time that morning, the silence did not feel empty. It felt occupied, like the land itself was holding on to something it had not yet decided to reveal. Caleb did not call to her or tug at the rope, because something in the way she stood told him that force would only break whatever fragile thread had brought her here. So instead he turned fully toward the distant hills and took a slow step forward, boots pressing into the dry soil with a dull crunch that seemed louder than it should have been. And for a moment nothing happened, the wind drifting low across the pasture, the fence creaking softly behind them. And then he heard it, the faint shift of hooves, one step, then another. And when he glanced back, the filly was moving, not beside him, not behind him in the way a trained horse might follow, but slightly ahead, just enough to suggest she knew the direction before he did. And Caleb felt a quiet tension settle into his shoulders, the kind that came before a storm even when the sky showed no sign of rain. And he let her take the lead without admitting to himself that he had already decided to follow. And they crossed the first stretch of open ground in silence, the barn fading behind them, the fence line shrinking into a thin line against the horizon. And the land began to change in small ways that only someone who had walked it for years would notice. The grass thinning into patches of brittle weeds, the soil shifting from packed dust to loose gravel that slid slightly underfoot. And Caleb's eyes moved constantly, reading the ground, searching for signs. But there were none, no fresh tracks, no tire marks, nothing but the filly's light prints forming one after another as she moved forward with steady purpose. And that absence pressed against his thoughts again, because a horse did not arrive alone without leaving a story behind, and yet this one had brought nothing with her except that note folded against his chest. And as they moved farther from the ranch, the wind picked up just enough to carry a different scent, something faint and unfamiliar, not strong enough to name, but enough to make the filly lift her head slightly, ears turning forward, her pace slowing as if she was listening for something just beyond the edge of sound. And Caleb stopped when she did, watching her closely now, noticing the way her muscles tightened, not in fear, but in focus, like a compass needle finding north. And she took a few hesitant steps to the right, then paused, then stepped again, adjusting her path with a quiet certainty that did not belong to guesswork. And Caleb followed, his jaw tightening as he realized this was no wandering trail. This was a direction chosen with intention, and the hills ahead rose in soft slopes of faded green and gray, their shadows stretching long across the ground despite the pale sky. And somewhere between those ridges lay whatever had pulled this animal across miles of land to his fence. And the thought settled into him with a weight he could not ignore, because he had spent years keeping his world small, predictable, contained within the boundaries of his ranch and the routines that kept the past at a distance. But now each step carried him farther from that line, farther into something he did not understand, and he reached instinctively toward his pocket, fingers brushing the folded note again, as if it might offer more answers the second time around. But it remained the same, silent and unfinished, and when he looked up, the filly had stopped once more, standing at the edge of a shallow dip in the land, where the ground darkened slightly, as if holding on to moisture longer than the rest. And she lowered her head, not to graze, but to press her nose lightly against the earth, holding it there for a long second before lifting it again, her gaze fixed ahead with renewed intensity. And Caleb stepped beside her, his boots sinking just slightly into the softer soil, and he followed her line of sight into the dip, where the land curved inward just enough to hide what lay beyond. And for the first time since leaving the fence, he felt something shift deep in his chest. Not fear, not yet, but the unmistakable sense that whatever they were walking toward was not waiting by accident, and that the quiet had not been empty at all, it had been patient. Caleb stepped down into the shallow dip with care, his boots sinking an inch into the darker soil, and the air shifted the moment he crossed that unseen line. Cooler somehow, quieter in a way that made the wind feel distant even though it still moved across the higher ground behind him. And the filly followed close now, no longer walking ahead but staying just off his shoulder, her breath steady, her presence grounded as if this place demanded a different kind of attention. And Caleb paused, halfway down the slope, his eyes scanning the curve of land that opened slowly before him, revealing a narrow stretch of earth that seemed untouched by time. The grass shorter here, pressed flat in places as if something had lingered longer than it should have. And he crouched slightly, running his fingers along the surface, feeling the difference in texture, the faint give beneath his hand that spoke of disturbed ground, not freshly turned, but not settled either. And he drew in a slow breath, the scent here sharper, tinged with something metallic he could not quite place. And the filly shifted again, stepping past him this time, her hooves placing carefully along the same flattened path, her head low, ears forward, every movement deliberate. And Caleb rose, following her lead once more, his instincts no longer questioning the direction but tightening around the reason. And as they moved deeper into the dip, the curve of land began to reveal more, a cluster of old wooden posts off to the side, half buried and leaning at uneven angles, their surfaces worn smooth by years of weather. And he recognized them immediately as remnants of something older than his ownership of this land, fencing from a time before boundaries were redrawn, before the ranch had been divided and sold. And he had always avoided this section, not out of fear, but out of habit, because it held nothing useful, nothing worth tending, just the quiet remains of what used to be. And yet now it felt different, not abandoned, but waiting. And the filly stopped near the edge of those posts, lifting her head slightly, her gaze fixed on a patch of ground just beyond them where the soil dipped again, more sharply this time, forming a shallow hollow no wider than 10 feet across. And Caleb felt his chest tighten as he stepped closer, the air growing heavier with each inch. And he noticed then the marks, faint but unmistakable, lines in the dirt that curved in irregular patterns, not natural erosion, not the work of rain or wind, but something made by movement, repeated, restless. And he crouched again, tracing one of the lines with his fingers, feeling the shallow groove where something had pressed against the earth over and over again. And the filly let out a soft breath behind him, stepping closer until her shoulder brushed lightly against his back, and Caleb did not move away, because in that moment it felt less like an animal seeking comfort, and more like a presence urging him to look closer, to see what had been missed, and he shifted slightly, leaning forward to study the hollow more carefully, and that was when he saw it, just at the edge, where the light fell unevenly across the ground, a small piece of metal half buried in the dirt, dull and weathered but unmistakably shaped by human hands, and he reached out slowly, brushing away the loose soil until the object came free, a broken clasp, part of a chain or a latch, its edges worn smooth but still holding the memory of what it once connected, and Caleb turned it over in his palm, the weight of it settling deeper than it should have, because it did not belong to this place by accident, and when he looked up, the filly was watching him again, her eyes steady, unblinking, as if she had led him here for this exact moment, and the wind, distant as it was, shifted just enough to carry a low sound across the hills, not loud, not clear, but present, and Caleb felt it move through him like a quiet warning, because whatever had happened here had not simply ended, it had been left behind, waiting for someone to notice, and now that he had, there was no turning back from it. Caleb closed his fingers slowly around the broken clasp, the cool metal pressing into his palm as if it carried more weight than its size allowed, and for a moment he did not move, did not speak, did not even breathe fully, because something about holding it made the silence around him feel different, no longer distant, no longer passive, but aware, as if the land itself had been waiting for someone to touch that exact piece and finally understand what it had been holding on to, and the filly stepped closer again, her presence steady and grounded, her shoulder brushing lightly against him in a way that felt intentional, not accidental, and Caleb rose to his feet, his gaze sweeping the hollow once more, slower this time, more deliberate, his eyes catching details he had missed before, the uneven spacing of the old posts, the subtle depression in the earth that suggested something had once stood here longer than it should have, something that had not been meant to stay, and he shifted, his weight, turning slightly to take in the broader shape of the land, tracing invisible lines between the hollow, the posts, and the narrow path they had followed down, and the pattern began to form, not clearly, not yet, but enough to settle uneasily in his thoughts, and he reached into his pocket, pulling out the folded note again, unfolding it with careful fingers, his eyes moving across the words once more, slower this time, reading not just what was written, but what had been left unsaid. Do not let her go back there before they come back. And the word there no longer felt vague, no longer distant. It felt anchored, tied directly to the ground beneath his boots, and Caleb exhaled, quietly, his jaw tightening as the meaning shifted from question to warning, and he glanced toward the far ridge instinctively, scanning the horizon again. But the land remained still, no movement, no distant vehicles, nothing but the low curve of hills and the pale sky hanging above them. And yet the feeling did not leave. It settled deeper instead, like the quiet before something returned, and the filly lowered her head once more, not toward the hollow this time, but toward the edge of the old posts, her nose brushing lightly against one of the weathered beams, and Caleb followed her movement, stepping closer, his hand resting briefly against the wood, feeling the rough grain beneath his fingers, and he noticed then the marks along its side, faint grooves carved into the surface, not random, not natural, but shaped by repetition, the kind that came from something pressing against it over and over again, something restrained, something waiting, and he pulled his hand back slowly, the image forming in his mind without needing words, and he turned again, this time looking beyond the hollow, past the posts, toward the deeper stretch of land that curved out of sight behind the next rise, and for the first time since leaving the fence, he understood that this was not the end of the path. This was only the place where it began, and the filly stepped forward again, moving past the hollow now, her pace steady but purposeful, her head lifting slightly, as if the next direction had already been chosen long before they arrived here. And Caleb hesitated for a brief second, his eyes flicking once more to the note in his hand, to the word back there, to the warning that now felt less like a suggestion and more like a boundary he had already crossed, and he knew then that turning around would not undo what had been set in motion, that whatever had brought this horse to his fence had not been asking for help, It had been placing it in his hands, and Caleb folded the note again, slower this time, tucking it back into his pocket with a quiet finality, and without another glance behind him, he stepped forward, following the filly as she led him out of the hollow and toward the unseen stretch of land ahead, where the silence no longer felt empty at all, but full of something waiting to be uncovered. The land beyond the hollow rose gently at first, then narrowed into a quiet stretch that felt older than the rest of the ranch, as if fewer feet had passed this way over the years, and Caleb followed without speaking, his steps slower now, more deliberate, each movement guided less by curiosity and more by a growing awareness that whatever lay ahead was not meant to be found by accident, and the filly moved with the same steady purpose, her ears fixed forward, her body aligned with something invisible but certain. And as they climbed the shallow rise, the wind shifted again, this time carrying a faint sound that did not belong to the open plains, a soft, irregular tapping, like something brushing lightly against wood or metal, too distant to place but too distinct to ignore. And Caleb stopped for a moment, his head tilting slightly as he listened, his breath held just enough to separate the sound from the wind. And there it was again, faint but present, and he felt a quiet tension tighten across his shoulders, not fear, but recognition, the kind that came when something familiar appeared in an unfamiliar place. And the filly did not hesitate. She continued forward, cresting the rise before him, and when Caleb followed, the land opened into a narrow clearing that had been hidden from view, a space no wider than 30 yards across, surrounded on three sides by low, sloping hills that curved inward like a natural boundary. And at the far end of that clearing stood a structure, small and worn, barely visible at first glance, its outline blending into the muted tones of the landscape. And Caleb slowed as it came into focus, his eyes narrowing slightly as details began to emerge, weathered wood walls, a sagging roof, a single door hanging slightly off its hinge, and a fence line that circled part of the clearing, not tall, not strong, but enough to mark intention. And he felt something shift in his chest, a quiet confirmation that this place had not been forgotten, it had simply been left alone. And the filly stepped into the clearing without pause, her pace unchanged, her path leading straight toward the structure, and Caleb followed at a measured distance, his gaze moving across the ground, noting the subtle signs of movement here that had been absent before, faint impressions in the dirt, not fresh, but not completely erased, patterns that suggested something had passed through this space more than once. And as they drew closer, the sound returned, clearer now, a soft rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from within or just beyond the structure. And Caleb felt his breath deepen, not from exertion, but from the quiet weight of understanding settling into place. And he slowed again, stopping just short of the outer fence, his hand lifting slightly, as if to steady himself against something unseen. And the filly reached the edge of the structure, her body still, her head raised, her gaze fixed on the door, and for a moment everything held in place. The wind stilled, the sound paused, and Caleb stood there watching, feeling the distance between where he had started that morning and where he now stood stretched far beyond miles. Because this was no longer about a horse tied to a fence. This was about something that had been hidden in plain sight, something that had waited quietly until the right moment to be seen. And as he took a step closer, the loose door shifted slightly, not fully opening, not fully closing, just enough to reveal the dark space beyond it. And Caleb felt the pull of that space settle into him, not as a command, but as an invitation he could no longer ignore. Caleb stood just outside the broken fence line for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the half-open door as it swayed slightly on its hinges, the faint tapping sound returning with each subtle movement. And the filly did not move closer. She remained where she was, her body angled toward the structure, but her hooves planted firmly in place, as if she had brought him this far and no farther. And that alone told him more than anything else could have, because until now she had led without hesitation, without pause. But here she stopped. And Caleb understood that whatever waited inside that structure was not meant for her, it was meant for him. And he took a slow step forward, then another, crossing the worn boundary where the ground shifted from open earth to a patch of hardened dirt that had once been walked more often than the rest. And the air changed again, carrying a stillness that felt contained, as if the hills themselves had closed in to hold this place apart from the rest of the world, and Caleb reached the door, his hand lifting instinctively before stopping just short of the wood, because something in him recognized the weight of this moment, the quiet line between not knowing and knowing. And once crossed, there would be no returning to the simpler version of this morning. And he exhaled slowly, then pushed the door open just enough to step inside, and the light shifted immediately, dimming into a soft gray that filtered through gaps in the walls, casting long, uneven shadows across the floor, and the smell inside was faint but distinct, aged wood, dust, and something else, something that lingered just beneath recognition, and Caleb paused just inside the threshold, allowing his eyes to adjust, his gaze moving slowly across the interior, taking in the shape of the space, a single open room, no larger than a small storage shed, with a few scattered remnants of use, an old wooden crate against the far wall, a rusted hook embedded near the door, and lengths of rope coiled loosely on the ground as if left behind in a hurry. And the tapping sound came again, clearer now, coming from somewhere deeper within the structure, not from movement, but from something shifting slightly with the wind, and Caleb stepped further in, his boots making a dull sound against the floor, and he followed the direction of the sound until his eyes settled on the back corner, where a narrow opening in the boards allowed a thin beam of light to fall across the ground, illuminating something small and still, and he crouched slowly, his movements careful, measured, and as he reached out, his fingers brushed against the edge of an object half hidden in the dust, and he pulled it gently into the light, revealing a small metal tag, worn but intact, its surface scratched from time, but still holding faint markings that caught the light just enough to be read, and Caleb tilted it slightly, bringing it closer, his eyes narrowing as the letters came into focus, and for a moment his breath caught, not from shock, but from recognition, because the name etched into that metal was not unfamiliar, not distant. It was something he had heard before, something tied to this land in a way he had never fully understood, and he turned the tag over in his hand, the weight of it settling into his palm as the pieces began to align, the hollow, the posts, the clasp, the note, and now this. And behind him, just outside the doorway, the filly let out a soft, steady breath, as if acknowledging that the path she had led him down had reached its turning point, and Caleb remained crouched there in the dim light, the tag held between his fingers, knowing that whatever story had been buried in this place had just begun to speak. Caleb remained crouched in the dim light, the small metal tag resting in his palm as if it had been waiting there all along, and he ran his thumb slowly across the worn letters again, not because he could not read them, but because something about seeing them and feeling them at the same time made the truth settle deeper, heavier, and the name did not come with noise or shock. It came quietly, like a memory returning without asking permission, tied to stories he had heard years ago, forgotten conversations about a neighboring spread that had changed hands too quickly, about animals that had gone missing without explanation, about a place people stopped mentioning because it was easier that way, and Caleb exhaled slowly, his eyes lifting from the tag to the walls around him, seeing them differently now, not as abandoned wood, but as something that had once held purpose, something that had been used and then left behind before questions could take shape. And he rose to his feet, the tag still in his hand, his gaze moving again across the interior, more deliberate this time, tracing the position of the hook near the door, the coils of rope on the ground, the scuffed marks along the boards at shoulder height, details that now aligned into a pattern he could no longer ignore. And the tapping sound came again, softer now, coming from a loose board near the back, shifting slightly with the wind that slipped through the cracks, and Caleb stepped closer, pressing his hand gently against the wood, stilling it, and the sound stopped immediately, leaving a silence that felt complete for the first time since he had entered, and he stood there for a moment, letting that silence settle, letting the pieces fall into place without forcing them, because the truth was not something that needed to be chased here. It was something that revealed itself once you were willing to see it, and behind him the light shifted slightly as the door moved with the wind, and he turned, stepping back toward the entrance, the brightness outside pulling him forward, and when he reached the threshold, the filly was still there, exactly where he had left her, her posture unchanged, her eyes steady, as if time had not passed for her at all. And Caleb stepped out into the open air, the space around him widening again, the sky stretching above in that same pale gray, but it did not feel the same anymore. It felt heavier, filled with something unspoken that now had form, and he looked down at the tag once more, then toward the clearing, the fence, the hills beyond, and he understood then that the note had not been about the filly returning here. It had been about something else entirely, something that had once belonged here, something that had been taken away and never meant to be found again. And the filly shifted slightly, taking a single step toward him, her head lowering just enough to bring her gaze level with his chest, where the folded note rested in his pocket, and Caleb felt that connection again, that quiet understanding without words, and he reached out, placing his hand gently against her neck, feeling the warmth there, the steady rhythm of life that had carried her across miles to bring him to this place. And for the first time since he had found her, he spoke, his voice low, not questioning, not doubting, but acknowledging what had already been set in motion, and though the words were simple, the meaning behind them carried further than the hills that surrounded them, because he was no longer standing in the middle of something he did not understand. He was standing at the center of something that had chosen him, and as the wind moved softly across the clearing once more, Caleb knew that whatever had been hidden here had not been waiting to be discovered by chance. It had been waiting for someone willing to follow where a quiet truth was leading, and now that he had, there was only one direction left to go. Caleb stood in the open clearing with the filly beside him, the wind moving gently across the hills as if nothing had changed, yet everything felt different now, heavier with meaning, and he slipped the metal tag into his pocket alongside the folded note, the two objects resting together like pieces of the same story finally brought into the light. And for a long moment, he said nothing, did nothing, simply stood there with his hand resting against the filly's neck, feeling the quiet strength beneath her skin, the steady rhythm that had carried her across distance and silence to bring him here. And he understood then that she had not been abandoned, not in the way he first believed. She had been entrusted, placed where she would be found by someone who would not turn away, and that realization settled into him with a calm certainty that replaced the unease he had carried since the morning began. And he lifted his gaze toward the hills once more, the same horizon he had looked at countless times before, but now it felt less like a boundary and more like a continuation, something that stretched beyond what he had allowed himself to see. And the filly shifted slightly, stepping forward with a quiet confidence that no longer felt like guidance but like agreement, as if the path ahead no longer belonged to her alone. And Caleb followed without hesitation this time, not because he was being led, but because he had chosen to continue. And they moved together across the clearing, past the worn fence, past the place that had held its silence for too long. And as they climbed back toward the open land, the air began to change again, the stillness lifting, the wind returning in soft currents that carried the scent of dry grass and distant cedar, familiar and grounding. And Caleb felt something within him settle, not into closure, but into understanding. Because some stories did not end when they were uncovered. They simply changed direction, and when they reached the top of the rise, he paused once more, turning back to look at the clearing below, the small structure now half hidden again by the curve of land, as if it had already begun to retreat into quiet, its purpose fulfilled, and he did not feel the need to return to it, did not feel the pull to search deeper or force more answers from what had already been revealed. Because the truth had never been about the place itself, it had been about the path that led to it, about the choice to follow something that did not speak in words but in presence, in instinct, in trust. And he looked down at the filly, meeting her steady gaze, and for the first time there was no question in it, no urgency, just a calm recognition, and he gave a small nod, almost to himself, before turning toward the direction of home. And the filly walked beside him now, not ahead, not behind, but in quiet step, her movement easy, unforced, as if whatever had called her forward had finally been answered. And as they crossed back into the open stretch of his land, the fence line coming into view once more, Caleb understood that the morning had not brought him something to solve. It had brought him something to carry, a truth that would not be spoken aloud, not explained or proven, but lived in the quiet choices that followed. And the wind moved across the pasture, lifting dust and light in equal measure. And somewhere in that motion, in that stillness between what was known And what was felt, the story settled into its place, not with noise or finality, but with the kind of silence that only comes when something has finally been understood, because sometimes the strongest truths are not the ones you uncover, but the ones that choose you, and all you can do is follow where they lead.